My name is Eleanor Whitaker. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the reliable one, the calm one, the person who doesn't make noise, doesn't need credit, and doesn't ask too many questions out loud. At work, people often describe me as steady. Outside of it, friends say I'm private, maybe even a little hard to read. What most people don't realize is that I see everything. I always have. I've spent years in leadership roles where trust is spoken about constantly, but transparency is treated like an optional courtesy. I'm the kind of person who listens more than she speaks, who documents instead of reacts, who waits before drawing conclusions. That patience has often been mistaken for softness, sometimes for naivety, and sometimes, most dangerously, for unconditional loyalty. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about a dramatic downfall or a perfectly timed speech that leaves everyone stunned into silence. There are no villains here in the cartoon sense, and there are no heroes either. What I want to share is something quieter than that. It's the story of how expectations can become invisible contracts, and how those contracts can slowly strip someone of agency, unless they choose to see clearly. When I say my boss expected loyalty without transparency, I don't mean a single moment or a single betrayal. I mean a pattern, a series of small assumptions layered over time. Assumptions that because I was capable, I would carry more. Because I was discreet, I would absorb more. Because I didn't demand explanations, I didn't need them. For a long time, I believed that staying calm was the same as staying ethical, that being loyal would eventually be recognized as integrity. I told myself that clarity would come later, that context would be shared when it mattered, and in doing so, I participated, quietly, in my own erasure. The emotional journey you're about to hear isn't fast. It unfolds slowly, the way realizations do. It moves from trust to confusion, from confusion to clarity, and finally to a kind of resolution that doesn't look impressive from the outside, but feels solid on the inside. There are moments when I chose silence, not because I was afraid, but because I was watching. There are moments where nothing seemed to happen at all, and yet everything was changing. I'm telling this story now not to settle scores, but to be honest about what happens when power is assumed instead of explained, and when loyalty is expected instead of earned. If you've ever been the person who held things together while being left out of the full picture, you might recognize some of yourself here. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and without judgment. Have you ever stayed quiet out of loyalty, only to realize later that no one had been honest with you in return? To them, I was dependable in a way that felt almost architectural, like a beam you assume will always hold because it always has. I wasn't the loudest voice in meetings or the one who filled silences just to be noticed. I was the person who followed through, the one who remembered details no one else bothered to write down, the one who could be trusted to handle the uncomfortable tasks quietly, without escalation. In performance reviews, the language was always similar. Eleanor is consistent. Eleanor can be counted on. Eleanor handles complexity well. It sounded like praise, and I accepted it as such. What I didn't notice at first was what was missing. There was no mention of leadership trajectory, no curiosity about my perspective, no invitation into the rooms where decisions were framed rather than executed. I was useful. That was the role. Not ornamental, not visionary, useful. When something went wrong, I was looped in early. When something went right, I was often informed later, as if the outcome had simply emerged on its own. I didn't mind, or at least, that's what I told myself. I believed that competence spoke for itself, that integrity had a way of surfacing without being announced. My boss used to say, "I trust you with this," often right before handing me work that came without context. Tight deadlines, vague objectives, missing pieces. I filled in the gaps instinctively. I asked the questions that protected everyone else from having to. I smoothed over conflicts before they reached the surface. And because I did it calmly, without visible frustration, it reinforced the idea that this was easy for me. What I didn't realize was that my calmness was being interpreted as consent. In meetings, people would glance at me when something complicated arose, then look away once they felt reassured it was handled. I became a kind of background constant, present but not central, trusted but not consulted. It's a strange place to exist because you're included just enough to feel responsible, but excluded just enough to remain powerless. I didn't feel mistreated. That's important to say. There was no overt disrespect, no sharp words or public undermining. That's why it took so long to notice the imbalance. Everything was polite, professional, reasonable on the surface. But beneath that, there was an unspoken hierarchy of information, and I was never at the top of it. I told myself that this was simply how organizations worked, that transparency was earned slowly, that loyalty meant doing your job without demanding explanations. I had internalized the idea that asking too many questions made you difficult, that visibility was something you waited for, not something you claimed. So I became smaller in ways that were invisible to others. I stopped offering unsolicited insights, even when I saw problems forming. I learned to phrase concerns as logistical details instead of strategic warnings. I absorbed ambiguity instead of challenging it, not because I lacked confidence, but because I believed patience was a form of professionalism. To my colleagues, I was safe, predictable, not a risk taker, not a threat, and that perception followed me everywhere. I was included when stability was needed, excluded when influence was distributed. What's difficult to explain is that none of this felt dramatic at the time. There was no moment where I thought, "I'm being underestimated." It felt more like standing slightly behind a glass wall, close enough to see everything, far enough that my presence didn't disturb the flow. And in a way, I helped build that wall myself. I rarely spoke about my long-term goals. I didn't advertise how much I understood about the inner workings of the company. I assumed that if something mattered, someone would tell me. I assumed loyalty would eventually be met with reciprocity. Looking back now, I can see how clearly defined my role was. To them, I was there to stabilize, not to shape, to support, not to steer, to hold weight, not to redistribute it. At the time, I thought I was being trusted. I didn't yet understand the difference between being trusted with responsibility and being trusted with truth. The first moment didn't announce itself as important. That's what makes it easy to dismiss in memory, even now. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no sudden shift in how anyone treated me. It was a small omission, almost polite in its subtlety. And because it was small, everyone else missed it, including me at first. We were in the middle of a systems change, one of those slow-moving transitions that touches everything without anyone fully owning it. I had been coordinating between departments for weeks, mapping dependencies, flagging risks, and making sure nothing collapsed quietly in the background. It was familiar work. I knew where the weak points were, and I had documented them carefully. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to be part of. Two senior leaders were discussing a timeline that didn't align with the constraints I had already raised, constraints they had acknowledged directly to me just days before. The details were specific enough that I knew this wasn't hypothetical planning. Decisions had been made. What struck me wasn't that they decided something differently. It was that the decision existed at all without my knowledge. Later that day, I checked my inbox. Nothing. No update. No context. No mention that the scope had shifted. I told myself it was an oversight, that someone had simply forgotten to loop me in. These things happen, especially in fast-moving environments. I had said that exact sentence to others more times than I could count, so I waited. By the end of the week, the new direction became an operational reality. Teams adjusted, resources moved, questions came to me. Questions I couldn't fully answer because the reasoning behind the change hadn't been shared. I did my best anyway. I always did. When I finally asked my boss about it, the response was calm, almost reassuring. Oh, that. We had to move quickly. I assumed you'd be fine adapting. I remember nodding, smiling even, saying something neutral like, of course. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, something registered. Not anger, not hurt, just a quiet recalibration. I realized that my involvement was conditional. I was trusted to execute under uncertainty, but not trusted with the uncertainty itself. No one apologized. No one thought they needed to. The work still got done. That was the metric that mattered. And because I handled it smoothly, the omission validated itself. If I didn't push back, then clearly it hadn't been a problem. That's how these things work. The absence of resistance is interpreted as agreement. I replayed the moment later, alone, not obsessively, just enough to understand it. I asked myself whether I had failed to communicate something, whether I had been unclear about my need for context, whether I was overreacting to something insignificant. I concluded at the time that it was insignificant, but the memory stayed. It stayed because it introduced a new pattern of awareness. I began noticing how often information arrived after decisions were finalized. How often was I briefed on outcomes instead of invited into discussions? How frequently my role began only once ambiguity had already been resolved elsewhere. Still, I said nothing. I didn't want to be seen as sensitive or territorial or difficult. I had built my reputation on composure, on being the person who didn't need to be managed emotionally. I wasn't about to undermine that over a single missing email. Everyone else moved on. They didn't see a cut because there was no blood, no visible reaction, just a slight internal shift, one that didn't change my behavior, only my attention. I started paying closer attention to what I wasn't being told. And that, in retrospect, was the real beginning, not of conflict, but of clarity. The moment I understood that loyalty, as it was being practiced around me, didn't require mutual transparency, it required adaptability, quietly, reliably, without question. At the time, I still believed that this was an exception, a one-off. I hadn't yet understood how easily exceptions become norms when no one names them. Once you notice something, it's hard to unsee it. What changed after that first omission wasn't the behavior around me. It was my interpretation of it. The pattern had likely been there before. I just hadn't had a name for it. Now every small exclusion landed differently, not as an isolated oversight, but as part of a quiet system. It never escalated in obvious ways. There were no dramatic power plays, no public contradictions. Instead, there were meetings I was invited to where the real decisions had already been made. Briefings that summarized conclusions without sharing the reasoning behind them. Projects that arrived on my desk fully formed, accompanied by a casual, "We'll need you to make this work." And I did. Every time. I told myself that this was simply the cost of being competent. The more capable you were, the more ambiguity you absorbed on behalf of others. I framed it as service, as professionalism, as maturity. I even felt a quiet pride in being the one who could handle complexity without needing to be walked through it. That pride became a shield, one that protected me from admitting what was actually happening. Each time I adjusted without comment, I reinforced the idea that my input wasn't necessary at the decision-making stage. Each time I solved a problem that could have been avoided with earlier transparency, I proved that withholding context had no consequences. Not for them, anyway. I began to notice how language was used around me. "We didn't want to overwhelm you. We figured you'd prefer to focus on execution. You're so good at handling things, we didn't think you needed the background." The words sounded considerate, even flattering, but they carried an assumption that my role was to respond, not to influence. I never challenged those assumptions directly. Instead, I rationalized them. I told myself that the timing wasn't right, that pushing for more visibility might be perceived as ambition, and ambition, especially when expressed quietly, often makes people uncomfortable. I told myself that staying agreeable preserved trust, that trust, once solidified, would naturally lead to greater openness. So I stayed quiet. I adjusted my expectations instead of theirs. I learned to work with partial information. I built contingencies for risks that hadn't been disclosed. I asked questions carefully, framing them as logistical clarifications rather than strategic concerns. I became fluent in reading between the lines, in interpreting what wasn't said. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. I was still respected, still included, still relied upon. but there was a subtle erosion happening internally, not of confidence, but of consent. I hadn't agreed to be excluded from context. I had simply adapted to it. What made it harder was that no one else seemed to notice, or if they did, they didn't name it. Colleagues assumed I was fully informed because I handled things smoothly. Leadership assumed I didn't need explanations because I never asked for them. And I assumed that if something truly mattered, I would be told. That circular logic kept everything in place. There were moments when I almost spoke up, when I felt the words forming. I need to understand why this decision was made, but I swallowed them. I didn't want to disrupt the calm. I didn't want to be seen as resistant or insecure. I had internalized the idea that professionalism meant absorption, not friction. Over time, the emotional cost of that absorption accumulated, not as anger, but as a low-grade fatigue, a sense of being perpetually one step behind, not because I lacked skill, but because I was intentionally kept there. I began to feel less like a participant and more like an interface, something information passed through, not something it originated from. Still, I stayed. I stayed because leaving felt premature, because nothing was technically wrong, because I believed that patience would be rewarded, that consistency would eventually translate into influence. That belief was comforting. It allowed me to endure without questioning the structure that made endurance necessary. But what I was really doing was normalizing a form of disrespect that was easy to overlook, precisely because it was so quiet. There was no single incident to point to, no clear boundary crossed, just a gradual narrowing of my role, defined not by what I could do, but by what I was allowed to know. And the longer I accepted that narrowing, the more natural it seemed to everyone, including me. It would take time for me to understand that silence, once normalized, stops being neutral. It becomes a signal. And in this environment, the signal was clear. I would carry responsibility without visibility, effort without agency, loyalty without transparency. At the time, I still believed I was choosing this. I hadn't yet realized how few choices I was actually being offered. There's a moment, quiet, almost administrative, when you realize that other people have already agreed on who you are. Not because they sat down and discussed it explicitly, but because their expectations align too neatly to be accidental. That's when I began to understand the role I had been assigned. I was the stabilizer, not the strategist, not the challenger, not the person brought in when the direction was still fluid. I was the one called after decisions had been made, when outcomes needed to be protected from friction. I was useful because I didn't destabilize things. I absorbed uncertainty instead of redirecting it. Once I saw that clearly, I started noticing how consistently the pattern repeated. New initiatives would surface, already shaped, already approved. My involvement would begin at the point where execution required care, diplomacy, and endurance. When ambiguity created stress elsewhere, it was routed to me, packaged as responsibility. Can you take this on? We need someone steady here. You're good at keeping things moving. None of those statements was false. That was the most disarming part. I was good at those things. but they also quietly defined the boundaries of my influence. I was there to maintain momentum, not to question direction. The role came with a kind of conditional trust. I was trusted to protect the system, but not to shape it. Trusted to handle consequences, but not to be present at their origin. It was a narrow form of respect, one that valued my output more than my judgment. I realized then how carefully I had been placed, not pushed down exactly, just positioned slightly to the side, close enough to feel included, far enough to remain manageable. And I had played along, often unconsciously. I rarely asserted my perspective unless invited. I waited to be asked. I believed that deference was a form of professionalism. That influence earned slowly was more legitimate than influence claimed. What I didn't see was that waiting had become my defining characteristic. In meetings, I spoke when prompted. In planning sessions, I focused on feasibility rather than vision. I became known for making other people's ideas work, not for generating my own. That reputation solidified over time until it felt almost fixed. When opportunities arose that required someone to challenge assumptions, my name wasn't mentioned, not because I couldn't, but because no one thought of me that way. I had been too consistent in my restraint. There's a subtle difference between being underestimated and being accurately measured within a constrained role. I wasn't invisible. I was legible in a very specific way, predictable, reliable, non-disruptive. That legibility made it easy to manage. I started to see how expectations traveled faster than facts, how people spoke about me in ways that never quite matched how they spoke to me. Eleanor will handle it. She doesn't need much direction. She's fine either way. Those assumptions followed me into rooms I wasn't in, shaping decisions before I ever had a chance to weigh in, and still I didn't object. Part of me believed that this was temporary. Those roles evolved, that once I proved myself indispensable enough, the boundaries would naturally expand. I had internalized the idea that visibility was something you were granted, not something you negotiated. So I stayed inside the role. I performed it well. I protected the image others had of me because it felt safer than challenging it. There was comfort in being trusted, even if that trust was incomplete. But comfort has a cost. The more I accepted the role of the reliable executor, the harder it became to imagine myself as anything else, at least within that environment. My identity began to compress around what was expected of me. I edited myself in small ways. I learned which questions were welcome and which were quietly inconvenient. I told myself I was being strategic, that patience was a strength, that staying composed preserved optionality. In truth, I was allowing my role to be defined by absence, absence of friction, absence of demands, absence of visible ambition. And while that made me indispensable in one sense, it also made me easy to overlook in another. The realization wasn't painful. It was clarifying. I finally understood that the role I had been assigned wasn't neutral. It served the system as it was, not the person I could become. And the longer I stayed within it, the more effort it would take to step outside. That understanding didn't change my behavior immediately, but it changed how I saw every interaction that followed. The shift didn't happen during a meeting or a conflict. No one said anything new. No boundary was crossed that hadn't already been crossed before. That's what made it unmistakable. The change came not from the outside, but from the way something finally settled inside me. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind that feels almost suspended in time. Most of the office had emptied out early for a conference I wasn't attending. Another small detail I noted without reacting. I sat at my desk, going through documentation for a project that had changed direction twice without explanation. Again, as I traced the timeline backward, I realized how much of my work over the past year had been corrective, fixing misalignments, bridging gaps, translating decisions I hadn't been part of into processes I was responsible for sustaining. I wasn't building forward. I was constantly stabilizing after the fact. The thought arrived fully formed without emotion. This is not accidental. For the first time, I didn't frame the situation as a misunderstanding or a temporary phase. I saw it as a structure, a system that benefited from my silence, my adaptability, my reluctance to disrupt. And I saw how well I had been conditioned to protect that system, even at my own expense. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. There was no anger, no sense of betrayal, just a clean internal acknowledgement, like finally naming a shape you've been walking around in the dark. I stopped working and leaned back in my chair. I didn't draft an email. I didn't make a plan. I simply let myself sit with the clarity. And in that stillness, something loosened. I realized that I had been measuring my professionalism by how much I could endure without complaint, by how invisible my effort could be. That metric had guided my decisions for years. It had also kept me small. The shift was this. I no longer felt obligated to preserve other people's comfort at the expense of my own agency. That didn't mean I wanted confrontation. I didn't suddenly feel the urge to demand explanations or expose inconsistencies. What changed was subtler. I stopped assuming that my silence was neutral. I began to see it as a choice, one I could reconsider. I thought about all the moments I had deferred, all the times I had trusted that transparency would arrive eventually. I understood then that waiting had become a habit, not a strategy. And habits, unlike values, can be changed. There was a sense of quiet resolve that settled in, not urgency, not rebellion, just the knowledge that I would no longer absorb ambiguity without examining who it served. I finished my work that day as I always did, thorough, calm, professional. No one noticed anything different. There was nothing to notice yet. But internally, I had crossed a line I wouldn't uncross. I began to observe more deliberately, not just what was happening, but how, when information moved, who was included early, who was consulted only after. I paid attention to patterns without reacting to them. I documented timelines not just for projects, but for decisions. This wasn't preparation for retaliation. It was preparation for understanding. I also noticed a change in how I listened to my boss. Statements that once felt reassuring now sounded conditional. Praise that once felt affirming now felt like reinforcement of the role I had already identified. I didn't resent it. I simply stopped internalizing it as validation. For the first time, I considered the possibility that loyalty, as it was being practiced here, was not aligned with my values. That loyalty without transparency wasn't virtuous. It was convenient. That realization didn't make me cynical. It made me precise. I understood that if I wanted something different, it wouldn't come from waiting to be seen. It would come from choosing when and how to engage, from deciding what I was willing to carry and what I was not. The day ended quietly. I shut down my computer, packed my bag, and left the office the same way I always did. There was no dramatic exit, no symbolic gesture. But as I walked out, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Alignment, not with the organization, not with my role, but with my health. And once that alignment exists, it changes the weight of every silence that follows. After that day, nothing on the surface changed. And yet, everything I did was filtered through a different internal lens. The silence that had once been automatic became deliberate. I was no longer quiet by default. I was quiet by decision. This distinction mattered more than I expected. Before, my restraint had been driven by a desire to maintain harmony. Now, it was driven by observation. I listened not just for what was said, but for what was consistently avoided. I noticed how often my boss spoke in broad assurances instead of specifics, how frequently timelines shifted without corresponding explanations, how accountability dissolved upward while responsibility flowed downward. I didn't challenge any of it directly. Not yet. I needed to understand the full shape of what I was looking at. So I stayed composed, engaged, professional. From the outside, I was the same Eleanor, steady, agreeable, reliable. Internally, I was no longer absorbing. I was assessing. I began to ask myself different questions. Not, how do I make this work? But why was this framed this way? Not, what do they need from me? But what information is being withheld and from whom? My silence gave me space to notice how others interpreted it. They mistook it for compliance, for acceptance. In meetings, decisions were announced with an expectation that I would adapt, as I always had. And I did, technically. But I stopped filling in the gaps emotionally. I stopped smoothing over the discomfort that ambiguity created for others. When someone asked a question that revealed confusion, I didn't rush to translate. When a risk surfaced that had been created upstream, I named it plainly instead of quietly compensating for it. Not confrontationally, just accurately. The effect was subtle but immediate. Conversation slowed. People had to sit with their own uncertainty instead of handing it to me. And because I remained calm, no one could accuse me of being difficult. My boss noticed first, though not consciously. I could see it in the way they began to check in more frequently. Casual questions framed as concern. Everything okay? You seem quieter lately, I responded neutrally. All good, just focused. Which was true. I was focused on the difference between being useful and being respected, on how often organizations confuse the two. I was focused on how power operates most effectively when it doesn't announce itself. I also became more intentional about what I documented. I kept records not just of outcomes, but of inputs, of who was consulted and who wasn't, of when information arrived relative to when decisions were made. I didn't share these notes. I didn't weaponize them. I simply kept them. This wasn't about building a case, it was about building clarity. The more I observed, the clearer it became that my silence had been doing more work than my voice ever had. By not reacting, I allowed patterns to repeat uninterrupted. By not interrupting, I could see the full arc. And that arc was revealing. I saw how loyalty was invoked selectively, how trust flowed downward in the form of responsibility, but upward only in the form of results. How transparency was framed as a burden rather than a right. None of this was malicious. It was systemic, comfortable, efficient for those at the top. What surprised me was how little resistance there was when I stopped compensating. The system adjusted around me, not gracefully but predictably. Gaps became visible, questions lingered longer, decisions felt heavier without the illusion of seamless execution. No one accused me of withholding support. They couldn't. I was still doing my job. I was simply no longer doing everyone else's emotional labor along with it. There's a particular kind of power in restraint that isn't fueled by anger, it's fueled by clarity. And clarity changes how you occupy space, even when you say very little. I didn't announce any of this. I didn't declare boundaries or issue ultimatums. I let my silence recalibrate naturally. Let others adjust their expectations without being told they needed to. They assumed I was still loyal, and in a sense, I was, to my values. What they didn't realize was that my loyalty had shifted away from preserving comfort and toward preserving truth. That shift didn't make me louder. It made me precise. And precision in environments built on assumptions is quietly destabilizing. What they never noticed was how much time I had been given. Time is the one resource people hand you freely when they believe you are harmless, when they assume you are aligned, compliant, and predictable. My continued calmness reassured them. My lack of confrontation signaled safety, and in that safety, I was given access, not to power, but to patterns. I didn't rush anything. I didn't need to. While others moved from meeting to meeting, reacting to whatever urgency had been declared that week, I stayed focused on the connective tissue. I paid attention to how decisions traveled, how long it took for information to move from one level to another, and where it slowed down or disappeared entirely. I noticed which conversations happened off calendar, which approvals were verbal, which risks were acknowledged privately but never documented publicly. I noticed how often I was asked to just take care of it without a corresponding trail of accountability. None of this required secrecy on my part. It required attention. I began organizing my notes differently, not by project, but by sequence. I mapped decisions backward, tracing outcomes to their origins. I marked where context was lost, where responsibility shifted, and where language became deliberately vague. Over time, those sequences formed a kind of internal map, one that showed me not just what was happening, but why. I also started learning more about areas I had previously trusted others to manage: compliance, reporting obligations, internal controls, not because I distrusted the people involved, but because I no longer believed that trust could replace understanding. I read policies I had never been expected to read. I asked neutral questions framed as curiosity, not challenge. No one objected. Why would they? I wasn't threatening. I wasn't pushing an agenda. I was simply being thorough. The more I learned, the more I realized how much of the organization relied on informal knowledge, things everyone assumed someone else was handling. Assumptions stacked on assumptions, systems held together by habit rather than clarity. And within those systems, my role had been to smooth over inconsistencies so they never had to be addressed directly. That smoothing had hidden vulnerabilities, and by stepping back from it, those vulnerabilities became visible to me, if not yet to others. I was careful not to change my demeanor. I didn't want to draw attention to the shift. I still met deadlines, still responded promptly, still offered solutions when asked. But I stopped preemptively solving problems that weren't mine to own. I let questions surface instead of intercepting them. What they mistook for continued loyalty was actually restraint. I also began to understand my own leverage, not in the dramatic sense, but in the practical one. I held continuity, institutional memory, an understanding of how things actually functioned beneath the org charts and polished presentations. I knew which processes were fragile, which relied on personal relationships rather than documented authority. I didn't exploit that knowledge. I respected it. There's a difference between hoarding information and stewarding it. I chose the latter. I made sure my understanding was accurate. I cross-checked assumptions. I verified facts quietly. I didn't jump to conclusions or construct narratives that flattered my sense of grievance. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about seeing clearly. What struck me most was how little curiosity anyone showed about what I was doing. As long as outputs continued, the inputs were irrelevant. My boss never asked what I was spending my time on, only whether things were on track. And because they were, until they weren't, no further inquiry seemed necessary. That absence of scrutiny was its own form of permission. I used that permission to position myself, not upward, but inward. I strengthened my understanding of the system until I no longer felt dependent on partial explanations. I stopped needing to be told what was happening because I could infer it accurately. And with that came a strange sense of calm. I wasn't planning an exit. I wasn't plotting exposure. I was preparing for optionality, for the ability to choose without panic when the moment came. Preparation, I learned, doesn't always look active. Sometimes it looks like patience refined into readiness. They never noticed the shift because nothing about my performance deteriorated. If anything, it became more precise, less frantic, more contained. The absence of visible struggle reassured them that everything was fine. But beneath that surface, I was no longer improvising. I was positioning, not against anyone, but for myself. And once you reach that point, once you stop being reactive and start being deliberate, the balance quietly changes. Power doesn't announce its arrival. It accumulates, invisibly, patiently. By the time they would eventually sense something was different, the groundwork would already be laid. Not through confrontation, but through understanding. And understanding, unlike loyalty, doesn't require permission. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden discovery, no single document that changed everything. It was quieter than that, more like the final piece sliding into place after a long period of careful alignment. What I uncovered had likely been there all along. I just hadn't been in a position to see it clearly before. It began with a routine review, a process I had overseen in fragments but never end to end. I decided, deliberately, to follow it all the way through. No assumptions, no shortcuts. I wanted to understand not just how it was supposed to work, but how it actually did. As I traced the flow, I noticed discrepancies, small at first, inconsistencies between what was documented and what was practiced, approvals that existed in name only, oversight that was assumed rather than verified. None of it was overtly unethical, but it was fragile, heavily reliant on trust, lightly supported by structure. And in that fragility, I saw the real leverage, not because I wanted to expose it, but because I understood who was carrying the risk. It wasn't leadership. It wasn't the organization as an abstract entity. It was the people at my level, absorbing responsibility without full authority or visibility. People like me. The realization was sobering. I felt no triumph, no sense of advantage, only clarity. I understood then why transparency had been treated as optional. Why was it shared selectively? The system functioned because people like me compensated for its weaknesses. We filled the gaps quietly, protecting the image of coherence. If we stopped doing that, even briefly, the cracks would show. And those cracks mattered, not for leverage in a power struggle, but for accountability. I sat with that understanding for a long time. I didn't rush to conclusions or actions. I needed to be sure. So I verified what I could. I cross-referenced policies. I reviewed historical decisions. I confirmed where responsibility actually landed when things went wrong. The pattern was consistent. I wasn't holding a secret in the dramatic sense. I was holding perspective, a full view that others either didn't have or didn't want to look at too closely. And that perspective changed how I understood my position entirely. For the first time, I saw that my silence had not only protected the system, it had insulated leadership from consequences. My competence had been a buffer. My discretion had been a shield. And while that had earned me trust in a narrow sense, it had also made me indispensable in a way that wasn't healthy. The private reveal wasn't that something was wrong. It was something was dependent on my continued willingness to absorb ambiguity, to interpret generously, to resolve quietly. And that dependence gave me a choice, not a loud one, not an aggressive one, but a real one. I could continue as I had, maintaining the illusion of stability, or I could redefine my participation without accusation, without drama, by aligning my actions with my values, by refusing to carry risk without clarity, by insisting quietly on transparency where responsibility was expected. The power in that choice wasn't external, it was internal. It came from no longer needing validation from a system that benefited from my silence. I didn't share this realization with anyone. Not my boss, not my colleagues. It wasn't theirs to manage yet. This was my recalibration, my internal boundary setting. I also didn't feel afraid. That surprised me. I had assumed that seeing leverage would feel dangerous. Instead, it felt grounding, like finally understanding the terrain I had been navigating blind. I took care not to romanticize the moment. Leverage isn't moral by itself. It's simply information paired with a position. What matters is how you choose to use it or whether you use it at all. For me, the reveal clarified one thing above all else. I would no longer offer loyalty without transparency. Not as a protest, not as a demand, but as a condition of my continued engagement. That didn't mean I planned to confront anyone immediately. It meant I would stop compensating for structural ambiguity. I would stop translating silence into permission. I would stop protecting comfort at the expense of clarity. The system would either adapt or reveal itself. And for the first time, I was prepared for either outcome. The reveal stayed private because it needed to. It wasn't meant to change others yet. It was meant to change me. And it did. Once you see clearly, indecision becomes its own kind of choice. I was standing at that point, not dramatically, not under pressure, but with full awareness that continuing as before would now be intentional. An intention carries responsibility. I laid out my options quietly, honestly. I could stay exactly as I was, continue performing my role with excellence, absorbing ambiguity, and compensating for structural gaps. Nothing would break. Nothing would change. I would remain trusted, relied upon, and quietly depleted. The system would continue to function, and my values would remain misaligned with my actions. I could confront my boss directly, ask for transparency, name the pattern, request inclusion earlier in the decision-making process. That option sounded reasonable on paper, but I understood the culture well enough to know how it would be received. It would be framed as a personal concern, not a structural one, a communication issue, not a power dynamic. I would be reassured, perhaps even praised, and then gradually sidelined as difficult. Or I could do something less visible, but more definitive. I could change my participation. That option didn't involve ultimatums or dramatic gestures. It involved boundaries, quiet ones. It meant I would no longer accept responsibility without authority. I would no longer act on incomplete information. I would no longer smooth over gaps that weren't mine to close. This choice was irreversible, not because it would cause immediate fallout, but because it would change how I was perceived once its effects became visible. There would be no returning to the role of the endlessly adaptable stabilizer. Once you stop compensating, people feel it, even if they don't understand why. I thought carefully about the consequences, not just professionally, but ethically. I didn't want to punish anyone. I didn't want to create chaos. I wanted alignment. I asked myself a simple question. What would it look like to be honest without being loud? The answer was restraint. I would do my work fully, but not excessively. I would document clearly, but not defensively. I would ask for context when it was necessary and pause when it wasn't provided. I would let responsibility follow clarity, not the other way around. This wasn't a power play, it was a recalibration. I also accepted that this path might lead me out of the organization eventually. not because I planned to leave, but because systems built on unspoken expectations often resist quiet boundaries. If transparency was truly incompatible with the culture, my presence would become uncomfortable simply by being precise. That was a risk I was willing to take. What made the decision irreversible was not the action itself, but the internal shift that preceded it. I no longer believed that loyalty required self-erasure. I no longer believed that patience without reciprocity was virtuous. Those beliefs had sustained me for years, but they no longer fit. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't need to. It was reflected in how I responded to requests, how I framed questions, and how I paced my work. Small changes, almost invisible in isolation, but together, they formed a boundary. The first time I declined to proceed without full context, I did so calmly. No accusation, no frustration, just a statement of fact. I'll need to understand the rationale before moving forward. The room went quiet, not tense, just surprised. No one argued. They simply adjusted. That adjustment told me everything I needed to know. The decision point wasn't a single moment. It was a line I crossed internally and then honored consistently. It required discipline, not courage, consistency, not confrontation. And once I stepped into that consistency, I felt something settle again. Not relief, not satisfied, just steadiness. Whatever came next, I would meet it without pretending. That was the choice. Once the decision was made, there was no dramatic shift in my behavior, only a quiet alignment between what I knew and how I acted. From the outside, everything still looked stable. Projects continued, deadlines were met, conversations remained polite. But beneath that surface, I had stopped improvising. I moved more slowly, but with intention. When new responsibilities came my way, I asked clarifying questions before accepting them. Not challenging ones, grounded ones. Questions about scope, authority, and decision ownership. If answers were vague, I paused. Not indefinitely, just long enough for the ambiguity to become visible to someone else. That pause did more than any argument ever could. I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been articulated. I stopped translating confusion into solutions automatically. When someone handed me a problem shaped by decisions I hadn't been part of, I returned it gently, asking for the missing context instead of silently reconstructing it myself. No one accused me of disengaging. They couldn't. I was still present, still responsive, still professional. I had simply stopped performing emotional labor in advance. I also became meticulous about documentation. Not excessive, just accurate. Decisions were recorded with names, dates, and rationales when available, and noted as pending clarification when they weren't. This wasn't defensive. It was factual. That factual tone changed the texture of interactions. Meetings became more careful. People began choosing their words with more precision, not because they feared me, but because ambiguity now had weight. It couldn't be handed off without acknowledgement. My boss began looping me in earlier on certain discussions. Not all of them, just the ones where the cost of exclusion had become slightly inconvenient. I noticed this without comment. I didn't reward it with enthusiasm or punish it with coldness. I accepted the information neutrally, the way it should have been offered all along. What struck me was how quickly the system adapted when it had to. The silence I maintained wasn't passive, it was structured. I spoke when clarity was required. I withheld when assumptions were being made on my behalf. I let consequences surface naturally instead of intercepting them. And still, no one noticed anything wrong. That's the nature of quiet movement. It doesn't trigger alarms. It doesn't demand attention. It simply shifts weight. I also took practical steps outside of daily work. I reviewed my professional options, updated documentation, reconnected with contacts I had neglected while being indispensable. Not because I planned to leave, but because I wanted freedom to choose without urgency. Preparation doesn't announce itself. There were moments of discomfort, mostly not mine. A project would stall briefly while clarity was sought. A meeting would end without resolution because responsibility hadn't been defined. In the past, I would have resolved those moments privately. Now, I let them exist, not to punish, to reveal. The absence of my silent compensation created space. In that space, patterns became visible to others, slowly, uneasily. No one named it directly, but I could feel the shift in energy. Things were no longer just working. They required attention. And attention, once required, changes dynamics. I remained composed throughout. I didn't correct narratives. I didn't remind anyone of past contributions. I didn't seek recognition for restraint. That would have defeated the purpose. The power of this approach lay in its neutrality. Silence, when chosen deliberately, is not empty. It's weighted. By moving this way, I wasn't forcing an outcome. I was allowing one. Whether the system adapted fully, resisted quietly, or began to fracture was no longer something I needed to control. I had done my part. What mattered was that I no longer felt trapped in my role. I wasn't waiting to be seen. I wasn't hoping for recognition. I was acting in alignment with my values, regardless of how it was interpreted. That alignment gave me something I hadn't realized I was missing: leverage without aggression, stability without self-erasure. Others would feel the consequences before they understood the cause. That wasn't a strategy. It was inevitability. And I stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said was already unfolding. The consequences didn't arrive with noise. They arrived as an absence, small delays, unanswered questions. Processes that once flowed smoothly now require follow-up. At first, it was brushed off as timing, workload, or bad luck. No one connected it to me, and that was precisely the point. I hadn't withdrawn effort. I had withdrawn substitution. Without my quiet corrections, the system had to confront its own gaps. I noticed it first in meetings. Conversations that once moved quickly now stalled when someone asked, "Who owns this?" Or, "Do we have approval for that?" Questions that had always existed, but were previously answered implicitly through my behind-the-scenes work. Now they lingered. People began looking around the room instead of at me. Not intentionally, instinctively. The expectation that I would absorb the uncertainty had weakened. And in its place, something else emerged: discomfort. My boss started asking more direct questions, not accusatory, curious. Why is this taking longer than expected? Did something change? I responded calmly with facts. The scope wasn't finalized. We're waiting on a decision. Statements that were always true but previously softened by my intervention. I didn't say because I used to fix this for you. I didn't need to. The organization began feeling the weight of decisions it had once distributed invisibly. Responsibility could no longer be assumed. It had to be claimed, and claiming it required clarity. What surprised me was how quickly anxiety surfaced. Not panic, but unease, a sense that things were slightly out of control, even though nothing was technically broken. Deliverables still existed, timelines still functioned, but the buffer was gone. I had been that buffer. Colleagues began reaching out more often, asking for clarification I didn't have. I redirected them gently. That decision was made upstream. You might want to check with leadership. Again, neutral, accurate, unemotional. Some of them were confused. A few were frustrated. None were angry at me. I hadn't changed enough to warrant that. I had simply stopped being invisible. The most telling moment came when someone said, almost casually, "Things feel harder lately." Not directed at me, just stated. I nodded. Yes, I said, they do. That was all. The consequences weren't punishment. They were exposed. Exposure of how much effort had been quietly compensating for a lack of transparency. Exposure of how dependent the system had become on unspoken loyalty. My boss began requesting more frequent updates, more detail, more foresight. I provided what I could, within the boundaries I had set. When I didn't have answers, I said so. That honesty, once rare, felt unsettling to others, but it was also contagious. Slowly, others began naming uncertainty too, admitting when context was missing, asking questions earlier. The culture shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly. There was less assumption, more articulation. Not everyone welcomed that. Some people missed the ease of the old way, the way things just worked. They didn't resent me. They resented the loss of comfort. And because I remained calm and consistent, there was nowhere to place that discomfort. The consequences continued quietly. Projects required more meetings. Decisions took longer. Accountability became visible instead of diffuse. None of this was catastrophic, but it was inconvenient. And inconvenience has a way of attracting attention. Still, no one confronted me directly. There was nothing to confront. I had followed every process, met every expectation. The difference was simply that I no longer filled the gaps silently. I felt a steady sense of calm throughout it all. Not satisfaction, just alignment. I wasn't watching others struggle with pleasure. I was watching a system adjust to reality, and reality, once revealed, is hard to ignore. The consequences had begun, not because I acted against anyone, but because I stopped acting for everyone. That distinction mattered. What came next would test whether transparency was truly valued or only appreciated when it was convenient. By the time the discomfort reached leadership in a form they couldn't dismiss, the conditions that had created it were already exposed. That's the thing about quiet shifts. You don't notice them until reversal is no longer possible. The first attempts to fix things were procedural: new check ins, additional meetings, requests for alignment. None of them addressed the underlying issue because the underlying issue had never been formally acknowledged. It lived in assumptions, not policies. My boss began looping me into more conversations again, this time with a different tone, less casual, more deliberate. Context was offered more often, but it came late, after the system had already felt the strain. It felt reactive, not reflective. I accepted the information without comment. I didn't reject it. I didn't reward it either. I simply integrated it where it belonged and continued operating within my boundaries. What had changed wasn't my openness, it was my trust. There was an unspoken urgency in the air, a sense that something needed to be restored. That ease, once taken for granted, was missing. But ease can't be reinstated by decree. It exists only when structures support it. I could see the effort leadership was making. It wasn't insincere, but it was also incomplete. Transparency was being offered as a corrective, not as a principle. And that distinction matters. At one point, my boss said something that crystallized everything. We may not have communicated perfectly before, but we're all on the same team. The statement was meant to reassure. Instead, it clarified the gap. Being on the same team had never been the issue. Being given the same information had. I didn't argue. I didn't correct them. I let the statement sit. Silence, again, did the work. By then, it was too late to return to the old dynamic, not because I refused, but because I couldn't unknow what I now understood. I had seen how easily transparency was sacrificed for speed, how loyalty was assumed rather than earned, how my silence had been interpreted as agreement. Even if leadership had suddenly become fully open, the trust required to make that openness meaningful had already been eroded. I noticed something else too. The panic wasn't about me. It was about the system, about the realization that stability had been outsourced to individuals rather than built into processes. That realization is unsettling, especially for those who benefit from the illusion of control. There were attempts to reassign responsibilities, to redistribute workload, to support me more. I accepted support when it was real. I declined it when it was performative, always politely, always calmly. The effort to fix things came too late because it focused on restoring function, not examining the cause. And without examining the cause, any fix is temporary. I felt no triumph in this, only a quiet sadness. Not for myself, but for the missed opportunity. If transparency had been offered earlier, consistently without prompting, the shift might never have been necessary. But systems rarely change until they're uncomfortable. My role, by then, was no longer flexible enough to absorb the discomfort on their behalf. I had moved beyond that version of myself. Not angrily, not definitely, just honestly. There was a moment when my boss asked, "What do you need to feel supported?" The question came late, but it was genuine. I answered truthfully. Clarity before responsibility. They nodded, took notes, agreed, and yet something remained unresolved. Because clarity offered under pressure is not the same as clarity offered as respect. One is a reaction, the other is a value. I could feel the gap between intention and structure, and I knew, without resentment, that it wasn't mine to bridge anymore. It was too late to fix it in the way they wanted, to restore the old ease without changing the underlying assumptions. The system would either evolve fully or it would continue to strain. Either way, I was no longer willing to be the silent solution. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. No raised voices, no dramatic reveals, just a closed door, two chairs, and a conversation that had been waiting quietly for months. My boss asked me to meet privately. The tone was careful, measured, not defensive, curious. That alone told me how much had shifted. I wasn't being managed anymore. I was being asked. We sat across from each other, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. There was no urgency in the silence. It felt settled, intentional. "I've noticed you've been more reserved lately," they said. Not accusing, observing. I want to understand why. I didn't rush to answer. I chose my words with the same care I'd used throughout the entire process. "I haven't been reserved," I said calmly. "I've been precise." That distinction landed. I could see it register, not as offense, but as information. I explained without narrative or emotion. I didn't recount every omission or justify every boundary. I focused on patterns, on how responsibility had been assigned without a corresponding context, on how silence had been interpreted as agreement, on how that dynamic had slowly eroded trust. "I realized I was being asked for loyalty without transparency," I said, "and I'm not willing to operate that way anymore." There was no accusation in my voice, no demand, just a statement of values. My boss listened, truly listened. They didn't interrupt or deflect. When they spoke, it was reflective, not reactive. They acknowledged gaps, admitted assumptions, expressed surprise at how much I had been carrying without visibility. I believed their sincerity. That wasn't the issue. The issue was timing. We talked about expectations, about roles, about what transparency should look like in practice, not just in theory. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had, and yet I knew, quietly, clearly, that it came too late to restore what had existed before. Not because the conversation was insufficient, but because my internal alignment had shifted beyond negotiation. I said this gently. "I appreciate the conversation. I really do, but I need to be clear about how I work going forward. I won't take on responsibility without full context, and I won't fill gaps that I didn't create." There was no pushback, just a pause, a recalibration. The confrontation didn't end in resolution. It ended in understanding. We didn't agree on everything, but we no longer misunderstood each other. That mattered. As I left the room, I felt no rush of adrenaline, no sense of victory, just a quiet steadiness, the kind that comes from speaking truth without heat. That conversation didn't fix the system. It didn't undo the past, but it did something more important. It clarified the future. I no longer needed to prove anything. I no longer needed to wait for permission. I had named my boundary, and it had been heard. Whatever came next would be shaped by that clarity. And for the first time, that was enough. I didn't walk out of that conversation feeling lighter in the way people often describe after standing up for themselves. There was no release, no rush. What I felt instead was grounded, as if something that had been misaligned for a long time had finally settled into place. Who I am now isn't defined by opposition to what happened. It's defined by clarity. I'm still calm, still observant, still deliberating, but I'm no longer shaped by the need to be endlessly adaptable. I no longer confuse endurance with integrity. The difference is subtle on the outside, but internally it's decisive. At work, I occupy space differently. I speak when context matters. I pause when it doesn't exist. I no longer rush to reassure others when uncertainty makes them uncomfortable. That discomfort is not a failure. It's information. I've noticed that people respond to me differently now, not with fear or resentment, but with a kind of attentiveness that wasn't there before. They listen more closely. They choose their words more carefully, not because I'm louder, but because I'm clearer. I don't take pride in being indispensable anymore. That identity was too costly. Instead, I value being aligned with my work, with my values, with my limits. Some relationships at work have softened, others have grown more distant. I've made peace with that. Proximity built on convenience isn't something I miss. The connections that remain are more honest, more grounded in mutual respect rather than silent expectation. What surprises me most is the absence of bitterness. I expected at some point to feel angry about how long it took to see what was happening. I don't. I understand now how easily competence can be exploited when paired with silence. I understand how systems drift toward convenience unless someone resists, quietly or otherwise. That understanding has made me more compassionate, not less, toward myself, especially. I no longer ask, why didn't they see me? I ask, why did I wait so long to see myself? The answer isn't shameful, it's human. I had believed that loyalty was proven by how much you could carry without being asked. Now I know that loyalty without transparency is not loyalty. It's an imbalance. And an imbalance left unaddressed eventually breaks trust on both sides. I'm not interested in dominance that requires others to shrink. The kind of strength I value now is quieter. It's the strength to say no without explanation, to ask for clarity without apology, to let systems reveal themselves instead of rushing to protect them. I haven't become hardened. If anything, I'm more precise with my care. I give it where it's reciprocated. I withhold it where it's assumed. Who I am now is someone who understands that silence can be powerful, but only when it's chosen. That patience is valuable, but only when it's mutual. That professionalism doesn't mean disappearing. I still carry my notebook. I still listen more than I speak. But what I write now isn't just about work. It's about patterns, about boundaries, about what I will when will not normalize. This version of me isn't louder, she's steadier. And that steadiness doesn't depend on recognition. It depends on alignment. There isn't a dramatic ending to this story. No moment where everything clicks into place and the system transforms overnight. Real life doesn't work that way. What there is instead is something quieter, and I've learned more durable: clarity. What stayed with me after everything settled wasn't the memory of being overlooked or even the slow realization of how loyalty had been misused. What stayed with me was the understanding that power doesn't always come from being seen. Sometimes it comes from seeing clearly and then acting in alignment with what you see. For a long time, I believed that being good meant being flexible, that being professional meant being agreeable, that being loyal meant accepting ambiguity without protest. None of those beliefs was malicious. They were inherited, reinforced, rewarded in subtle ways, but they came with a cost. The cost was the agency. The cost was voice. The cost was the slow erosion of consent. What I learned is this: when transparency is withheld, silence doesn't preserve harmony, it preserves imbalance. And when that imbalance is normalized, it becomes invisible not just to others, but to you. The shift didn't require confrontation. It didn't require exposure or retaliation. It required something much harder: restraint paired with honesty, the discipline to stop compensating, the courage to let systems feel their own weight, the patience to allow consequences to surface without rushing to soften them. Quiet dominance, I've realized, isn't about control. It's about refusal. The refusal to carry what isn't yours. The refusal to confuse loyalty with self-erasure. The refusal to protect structures that depend on your silence to function. There's a strange peace that comes with that refusal. Not because everything becomes easier, but because it becomes clearer. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop explaining what should already be understood. You stop waiting for permission to exist fully in the roles you inhabit. If there's a moral here, it's not stand up and be heard. That advice is too simple, too loud. The real lesson is more nuanced. Pay attention to what your silence is doing, not what it avoids, but what it enables. Silence can be wisdom. It can be a strategy, but it can also be a habit that others quietly benefit from. The difference lies in whether it's chosen or assumed. Today, I still value loyalty deeply, but only when it's mutual, only when it's supported by truth, only when transparency isn't something you have to earn by overperforming. If this story resonated with you, it might be because you've lived a version of it yourself. Maybe you've been the reliable one, the calm one, the person who made things work while being left out of the full picture. Maybe you're still there now, telling yourself it's temporary. So I'll end with this, not as advice, but as an invitation to reflect. Have you ever realized that your silence was holding more power than your voice? And if so, what would change if you chose it differently? I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments.